Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for being here this afternoon. This is our 7th annual Aging with Grace program. This year, we are so excited to have this wonderful panel ahead of us. My name is Carol Gross. I'm a volunteer and a member, and I'm just really excited to see everybody here. We had no idea how many folks were going to be showing up for this great program, and this attendance is terrific. We are going to be recording. It'll be from the back, so the only thing that anybody will see is your heads, except for our wonderful panel up here. And that recording is going to be available on the Viva Village website sometime in the next few weeks. We just need to get the technical pieces of it all put together. I'm really glad to acknowledge our sponsors this year: Rick Edmonds from Safeway on Cornell, Washington County Dave's, Trader Joe's, Cornell Farms, and this certainly wonderful Southminster Church, who has provided the facilities for us and given us a great break on the price, and we just really appreciate their hospitality and their technical expertise and everything else that we have going here at this wonderful location. Also, I want to make sure, and I know some of these people are still going to be walking around and doing last-minute things, but the Aging with Grace Committee, Kathy Fradkin, Ray Coleman, Sandy Ruff, Wally Carey, Karen McCune, Dennis Isaacson, and Kathy Brown. We have been working on putting this program together since the end of January, so it's been a long and interesting and very rewarding process to put this together. But if those folks can raise their hand, or I think most of them are probably in the back. We've got folks. And then I also recognize Nancy McNary and her team, who are busy putting together some really wonderful snacks for our break. And they have done, once again, they have put together some really terrific things. So all of you should have a packet, either on your lap or under your bottom. We put one on all the chairs. Just wanted to kind of go through there real quickly. You're going to have some biographies of our guest speakers today, and I hope that you take the time to read those, because I don't want to. We're a little bit crunched for time today. We have to be out of this room. All of us have to be out of this room by 4 o'clock sharp. And so I hope you will read their biographies. And if you want to get in touch with any of our presenters today, just call the office and they will give you their contact information. We neglected to put that in the program. There's also, you're going to have a bibliography that I think will help you if you want to pursue this topic a little further. We've got some great resource lists. And there's also, you'll notice, a little 3x5 card and one of the high-class pencils that we want all out to buy. What we're going to do this year is, because there's so many people, we want you to write down the questions that you might have during the presentation, and then volunteers will be in the back of the room to pick those up as we leave for the break. We're then going to go through and find general themes that are going to be there, and we're going to pick questions. And then when we come back from the break, we're going to have our panelists answer those and address those questions. Also, the other thing you're going to find is an evaluation, and these evaluations are so important to us on the committee, because we have. This today is actually the result of, in part, because of the evaluations we've had in the last couple years. So we want you to be as honest and as open as possible. And if you could do those, you might want to do those during the break, and there'll be volunteers to collect them, again, in the back of the room. But we do really appreciate your honest feedback for the program today. As you noticed when you came in, these chairs are all brand new at the church, And the church has asked us not to have food or drink here in the sanctuary. But anywhere else in the building, it's fine. And like I say, we've got some great refreshments during our break. That break is going to be at about 2:30. We're going to take half an hour for that break, and then we'll come back and start promptly 30 minutes later. So we'll have a half an hour to go to the restrooms, which are, if you go out, turn to the right, go through where all the chairs and tables are set up, and go through those wooden doors, and the restrooms are right back there, okay? So how did we do this, and how did we come up with the panel? Well, as I say, we started this process in January, and we started interviewing people right away, folks that we thought would be really interesting to be a guest speaker for today's program. And what we realized as we were interviewing these folks is they had a lot to say, and we interviewed several people, and we started thinking, wouldn't it be great if some of these people could come together and have a conversation? Because as we were listening to these conversations, it was very informal, but very instructive. We thought, wouldn't it be great to have 3 or 4 people with different perspectives on this topic, conscious living, conscious dying, and kind of eavesdrop on what those conversations might be. So what I encourage you to do is eavesdrop on these conversations, think about what's being said, and like I say, if you have any questions, we'll be glad to address those later. So I hope that you find this conversation that we're going to eavesdrop in as thought-provoking as we did when we interviewed these speakers. And without further ado, I want to do that and introduce you. So we have Captain Joe Lawrence, Chaplain. She's a captain in our hearts. Chaplain Joe Lawrence, writer, teacher, and death doula Nancy Linnon. On the end, hospice program director, Jennifer Traeger, right here, and then our moderator and life cycle celebrant, Holly Pruitt. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Holly. She's going to kind of lead this conversation. And then, like I say, at about 2:30, we're going to take a 30-minute break. And thank you all very much for being here, and I hope you get as much out of this as we have already listening to these speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol, and thank you so much, Viva Village and the Aging with Grace program team. I have a very special place in my heart for Viva Village and the Village movement. My mom was the founder of a village back in Connecticut, and Ray and I figured out that I and my wife and her father were at the very first Viva Village organizing meeting. So what a thrill to see what you were all building together. So let's give another round of thanks to all the folks who put this together. And I want to thank each and every one of you for your presence here today as well. I think I speak for our panelists in saying that we're very honored and we're also very humbled to be held by the trust that the planning committee and all of you have placed in us to offer us the chance to just provide a few openings for this important conversation that you're all engaged in as a community. And I want to acknowledge that for many of us here, perhaps most of us here, the topic of dying, the topic of death, is not an abstract topic. There may be those here among us who are living with the terminal diagnosis. Certainly many who live with the awareness that the number of days behind you are greater than the number likely ahead. There may be those of you who are caregivers for beloveds in your family that are living with chronic or terminal illness. Many of you here may feel very marked by the grief of recent deaths in your own life, living widowed, living solo, having many of your peers died. I know members within Viva Village that you may be missing as we gather here today. And certainly when we come together like this, we're all aware of the deaths that are in our future for each of us. So I'm going to take a moment and ring my singing bell and just invite us to welcome in the presence of all that may be here with us when we open up this topic. Now, I find that some of the most satisfying conversations, and that's what we're here to do, is have a conversation, are fueled by curiosity, by compassion, and likely by more than a little courage, especially on this topic. So as explorers, we might look through a telescope to get the far view, or we might look through the microscope to examine some of the minute details, or maybe a magnifying glass or our readers to see more clearly what's right in front of us. But as we settle in to hear from our panelists in a moment, I want to suggest that perhaps the best metaphor for the next couple of hours is a kaleidoscope. Each of our panelists is going to present perspectives, both from their personal and professional experiences, that will offer a series of lenses, multifaceted lenses, a glimpse into our topic that we hope will open our minds, open our hearts a little bit more to perhaps new possibilities for how we might view these topics in this conversation. And that by shifting this kaleidoscope, it might open us up to even more of our own curiosity and compassion and courage for how we take these conversations back into our families and our community. So we're going to hear from each of our panelists in turn in some depth. We've asked them each to reflect on a set of questions that the Planning Committee put together about conscious living and conscious dying from each of their own ways of approaching that in the world. We're going to begin with Jennifer, and then without further introduction, she'll sort of pass the invisible baton to Joe, and then we'll end with Nancy's initial remarks. And after each of them have been able to share with you, we'll, as a panel, have a little conversation that, as Carol said, you'll eavesdrop in on, jotting down your own questions and thoughts, we hope, for after the break. And so we'll dive in here. Jennifer, thank you so much for getting us started.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Can everyone hear me okay? Sounds right. I already managed to drop my microphone and my notes once, so I feel like I got that out of the way. So thank you all for being here. It really is an honor to share this time with you. And I have been thinking so much about what would I share this morning or this afternoon. And I thought I'd get us started with 3 thoughts that I have about why it's even important that we're having this conversation. Like, why come together on a Saturday afternoon and talk about death? We could all be doing something different. So why is this even an important thing to do? And so the first is, I feel I have learned in my own life and through my work in hospice that death is perspective giving, and that encountering death can actually put us in touch with gratitude, with connection and joy. And those things may seem counterintuitive. We've all lived through some things, I'm sure, in this room, and one of the things that I've seen over and over when I've encountered death in my own life and in the lives of others is that there are often these kind of paradoxical elements to the experience of encountering death. And, the fact that death is non-negotiable for all of us is really kind of a defining factor in our lives. And yet, often it's not something we talk about with other people. Those of us who work in hospice know that, at a cocktail party, the "what do you do? I work in hospice" can either be a repellent or it opens up sometimes these really deeply intimate conversations that you probably wouldn't normally have at a cocktail party. So we do, I think, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but I will say I think there are elements of our larger culture that are all about really avoiding death and the topic of death, loss, grief, aging. And that takes a lot of energy, doesn't it? It really can take a lot of psychic and emotional energy to push aside something that is in fact a reality for all of us. And so, since we're talking about death on a Saturday, I thought I'd share a quote from Nietzsche. Why not, right? And, he was a German philosopher in the 19th century, and he had quite an amazing mustache and a terrible love life. And he was really interested in the question of suffering and kind of human potential. And he said this, I thought was interesting. If you refuse to let your own suffering lie upon you for even an hour, and if you constantly try to prevent and forestall all possible distress way ahead of time, if you experience suffering and displeasure as evil, hateful, worthy of annihilation, and as a defect of existence, then it is clear you harbor in your heart the religion of comfortableness. How little you know of human happiness, you comfortable people, for happiness and unhappiness are sisters and even twins that either grow up together or, as in your case, remain small together. So I love that quote, and I think he's pointing at something, which is if we spend all of our energy pushing away this reality that there is suffering, that there is death, we may be missing out on some really important and rich things. I recently heard an interview by Krista Tippett with a poet named Ross Gay, and he has written a number of things, and in the interview he said that kind of the focus of his creative work was the subject of joy. And interestingly, he said, joy is dependent upon the experience of acknowledging that we're all dying. The fact of death and the fact that we are all essentially always on our way towards death can create a place of tenderness and connection, of experience, and those seem to be the necessary conditions for joy. So that's my first thing for you to chew on. My second point is that dying and loss really do represent the ultimate loss of control, and yet to not face them is really to risk missing some opportunities to shape your experience if you are fortunate enough to have some warning that it's coming, and to understand the experience and to live more deeply. And, most of us really don't want to experience the loss of control over our bodies. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm glorifying suffering. There's nothing to glorify there. In hospice, our passion is really to address suffering for people. But I really think that if we are so unwilling to acknowledge, for example, that we might need help at some time, which is really, I think, something that we're trained up to believe we shouldn't ever need again once we get past childhood, we might really miss an opportunity to convey or exercise some control over the conditions of our dying process if we can't ever communicate with people about it. I also feel like I have seen in my experience that we're not always very good at predicting how we're going to feel about things that are happening to us in the future. We all have ideas about it. Like, it would be absolutely intolerable if I needed someone to help me get in and out of my bed. And yet, over and over again, what I see is that often as people face these experiences, they may find that it's not as intolerable as we believe it is going to be. And so I think there's value in kind of building the muscle of acceptance, of encountering these things that seem to us as though they just could not ever be tolerable. And fortunately or unfortunately, life is constantly giving us experiences of losing control. Some of us are feeling real out of control after the election, right? And so what do we do with that? Is that an opportunity for us to practice something as we prepare for death? A last point that I'll make is that I believe death and dying and grief are developmental processes, just like other parts of our life. That we think of dying or death as an end of something or the disintegration of something, and it certainly does involve those things. But over and over again, when you're with people who are dying, you will see that they are transforming and growing, and that the ability to kind of find meaning in those experiences is really inherently human and part of the process. Some of you may have read or heard the wonderful reporting that was recently done by the New York Times on Dr. Kerr, who is a hospice physician who is really focused on studying the deathbed visions that people often have as they're dying. And really trying to say, this is a distinct phenomenon from hallucinations, from delirium. It's actually a thing that's part of the dying process, and what does it mean to people as they experience it? And one element of his research that really touched me was that they interviewed people who had had these visions in their own dying process as they were dying, and many of them reported feeling transformed by them, that it had learned things, they had let go of trauma, that they felt healed. And so the idea that that's happening even as we're moving into the end of our lives is very powerful to me. The last thing I'll share, and then I'll hand it over to Joe, because I don't want to abuse my time, is I really, I get to work in hospice, which has been just incredible, and now I don't work with patients any longer, but I support a team of really amazing people. And I often say to the leaders on my team, our job is really to create the conditions for people to show up and really shine and really be present. And I take great joy in that. And I was thinking about, last week was actually the anniversary of my mother's death, and she died after a really difficult period of several years with dementia. And so, my family and I had really a challenging journey of taking care of her. And she was just an incredibly bright and engaged person, and her passion in life was language and reading and writing. And she taught me to read, and many hundreds, probably thousands of other people. And she slowly lost her ability to speak and eventually didn't know who I was. And prior to dying, went through a really difficult summer of being very agitated and fearful. And I was talking with someone who knew her after she died, and this person said to me, I stayed away because I don't think your mom would have wanted us to see her in the state that she was in before she died, and I wanted to remember her as I had known her previously. And so, I've heard people say things like this before, and I tried to greet it with with an open mind. And initially my reaction was, well, that's a real privilege that you had, right? That you could choose, because some of us have to take care of these people that we love. But then it really did actually open up a question for me. And that question was, what would I have missed out on if I had not been there through even the really horrible parts of that process? And some of it was, quite frankly, horrible. And I was remembering two things. One, that toward the end, I had to really just focus on creating these moments for her of pleasure and connection. And so I read to her a lot because she loved literature. And the last book we read together was Housekeeping by Marilyn Robinson. And if you've read that, it's so beautifully written. And I remember watching her and realizing, oh, she can't speak, but she is enjoying the music of the language, right? She was responding to all the same things that I was responding to. And then the second thing I remembered was the opportunity that I had to tuck her into bed and snug her into her blanket and kiss her goodnight and give her the kind of comfort that she had night when I was a child. And, you know, we might look at that and think, oh, that's so sad. She's the mom, you're the daughter. Like, but for me, it was an experience of love, loving and being loved that transcended language, role, all the trappings of identity, and that is totally a treasure that I take away from that experience. So I'm going to stop.
Wow, I wasn't done listening. Wow, just want to take in a minute to just feel the gratitude for everything you just shared. Thank you. I wanted to start my words here, just looking at the time, with just really quickly but preciously with a land acknowledgement, which is becoming a part of practice across the globe. And we, right here in this place, are on the unceded and traditional territories. I have it written down so I don't forget any people, of the Multnomah, the Wasco, the Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malaya, and many other people who have lived and raised families and cultivated the land since time immemorial. And of course, Indigenous people are not a thing of the past, so their descendants live among us. And this occurs to me as always important, no matter what we're talking about. Sorry, there's a little echo. I think if we're going to think of living consciously, and if we're going to think of doing that at a time in light, almost especially of what happened this week, how do we do that with the most respect? And respect to me means being attentive to the details of people's lives, of the truth of historical context, of the meaning of community, of really listening. Sometimes we think we're listening, but listening, of course, some of it happens here, but a lot of it happens here in this heart. So I'm grateful to be here, and I trust that the blessings and gifts of the Indigenous people of this land inherently are coming through to this place and are with us right now. So it's a Providence. I'm a hospice chaplain for Providence, and it's a tradition in our community that with any gathering, we share a reflection. Of course, you know, everybody here has done a version of that. I hate to have my phone. Sorry about that. It's very uncouth, but I don't have a printer, I'll be honest. So I wanted to share this reflection. My understanding of a reflection is that we're all coming from different places and we're all landing still. And it's a way of grounding us into this moment. And especially, again, I'm going to reference the heart a lot. To me, that's the epicenter of human life. So I love this reflection, this reading. I invite, as you listen to these words, to consider what we're here to discuss. And Jennifer so beautifully spoke of the potency of this subject matter and how it can sometimes be upsetting or triggering or disconcerting. So we're inviting for ourselves and for all of you to step into that place of bravery and courage, which is inherently within you, and no doubt you know of it. So this is a piece by Yehuda Halevi, who is a Jewish mystic, and it is called "'Tis a Fearful Thing." 'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch, a fearful thing to love, to hope, to dream, to be, and oh, to lose. A thing for fools this, and a holy thing to love. For your life has lived in me, your laugh once lifted me, your word was gift to me. To remember this brings painful joy. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing to love what death has touched. Let me read the last few lines again. I always need to hear them. 'Tis a human thing, love, a holy thing to love what death has touched. It's nice to be here with all of you. Thank you for the honor of your time and your, there's just so many places we could be, and I'm grateful that we're all here together. So I am a hospice chaplain for a long time, I think something like my 13th year. It doesn't really matter in some ways, but perhaps like every year that I age, I feel gratitude for the lessons learned and the benefit of those lessons to then cultivate one's presence to be more useful in a world and clear and supportive and kind. And like Jennifer said, it's almost like we planned, we didn't. I had no idea what Jennifer was going to talk about. But there's something about doing the kind of work we do. It can be a conversation stopper. You know, someone says, what do you do for a living? And often you sort of pause and you think, how's this going to go? And people will often say, wow, that must be sort of depressing. Okay. Well, it's not that actually. It's sad sometimes. It's tender a lot. It's complex. It's meaningful. It's intimate. Sometimes it's devastating, depending on the circumstances. But I have such gratitude for it. Of course, Spirit knows more than I know around where I was supposed to end up. I didn't preempt this as a young person. It kind of just unfolded in front of me. But I'm grateful because literally I'm not the same because of this work. It happens on a cellular level that every single person, I love the word encounter, every person that we encounter, every situation changes us. And always for the better, even if it jars us or makes us weep in our car when we leave, or it brings on a deep grieving process. But I feel like it's made me more brave. It's certainly made me tangibly, pragmatically more useful, which I'm grateful for. And if we're thinking of living consciously, dying consciously is one piece, actually. Not one thing's happening over there, the other's happening over there. The two literally inherently must live and breathe, as was spoken of as sisters. And as a twin, actually, I relate to anything about that, because this, to make a whole, we need lots of different pieces. And that's also the preciousness of diversity of experience and diversity of our brothers and sisters that we share the planet with. We're constantly learning. So to live consciously, one must truly turn toward that which is not always comfortable, which is the knowledge and inevitability of our mortality. So anyway, I want to make sure I don't go over time, but I wanted to say that I'm forever changed, and there is a Rolodex in my heart of the myriad people that I have literally watched take their last breaths. Not sort of abstractly, but literally been there. And certainly felt the energetics of, spiritual presence and the beauty, regardless of spiritual or religious tradition. It's a human thing. And doctrine is helpful, but it's not everything. That we all go through it, and it's quite precious. So I wanted to, just as Jennifer mentioned, sort of bring some things to the table which might be tangible for you to engage today, but also moving forward. I think it's helpful to have pointers and structures and places for us to engage, especially sensitive or thought-provoking material. And a huge part of my spiritual practice as a chaplain and just as a human is the Buddhist tradition, specifically steeped in the Soto Zen tradition, which comes out of Japan. And one of my favorite Buddhist scholars is Dr. Paula Arai, who now teaches at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, which is where I attended. And one of my favorite books that she wrote, I'm literally not even going to read from it because it's so in my head, but I wanted her here. So I have one of her books, which is literally, you can probably tell I've used it quite a bit, but it's Bringing Zen Home, the Healing Heart of Japanese Zen Women's Rituals. This book is beautiful, and very much so because it's woven into lived everyday life, death, grief, childbirth, all of it. And Paula spent a long time with a group of Japanese lay women, householder women. To those maybe not familiar with that language, in the Buddhist tradition, people who are not living in a monastic way are regarded as householders. I'm a householder. So we raise kids or go to work, or we weave the practice into daily life. And one of my most favorite parts of this book is that Paula and the women collaborated to come up with 10 healing principles. And I wrote my divinity school thesis on the application of these 10 healing principles to end-of-life work, because I was already working as a hospice chaplain. Now, obviously, we don't have time to go through all 10, and they're not linear anyway, as Buddhist teachings are not 1 through 10. It doesn't work like that. Everything's interwoven. But I want to share just a couple of these healing principles because I think that they will resonate with you as much as they resonate with me. And they, again, don't need to be met through a Buddhist lens. If that's not your religious tradition or knowledge base, it's completely fine. The women and Paula say, just listen and give them a try. And like the Buddha said, or is attributed to have said, listen to these teachings. If they resonate to you, great. If they don't, let them go. But I think they will. So the first of the healing principles is experiencing interrelatedness. So that sounds like a tall order, but a fundamental teaching in the Buddhist tradition, and actually interreligiously, but it's specifically enunciated in different ways in each tradition. It's like the ground under our feet, the reality that we are inherently one. And in mainstream or colonial culture, that might be sort of like, oh, that sounds really sweet. Well, it's sweet or not, but it's true. And I'm sure this last week, and as we've comprehended through our hearts and minds so many things, just basically since we've been alive. We feel the tug of that one. If we think of one fabric, when one even tiny thread moves, whether we're cognizant of it or not, it tugs on us. And certainly the closer it gets to us, our loved ones, our mother, my wife died in the spring. You know, these bigger things, they actually in some ways make you feel like you're being thrown out of a moving car, quite frankly. Life is pretty or easy. But the experience of interrelatedness is fundamental, and it's what we're all doing here today. Instead of comprehending or leaning into these conversations or these provocative subjects of death and dying, or even living consciously, it can feel a lot to do it alone. So instead, this precious community said, well, let's come together and do it together. So that's one thing to consider, not to mention the fact that the premise of hospice really is to do all of these things in community. That's how it's supposed to be, including how we work together as a team. So one of the last healing principles is accepting reality as it is. In mainstream culture, that can feel aggressive. You have to accept. But I don't want to accept. You have to accept. What does that even look like? In my work and my understanding, and of course, everything that's spoken of in the Buddhist tradition is enveloped in compassion. How do we do that? How do we do it gently, softly? God willing, we have time to do it slowly. We don't always. People of Gaza, they don't have time to go through that process slowly, and many other people. But we consider even turning toward the elephant in the room, whether it's terminal illness, the reality of a loss, but especially when it comes to death and dying. And what I've seen is if we're even willing to pivot a degree or two, I'm not asking people to swallow a whole process in one go. In fact, I don't recommend it. I think it can make us ill. But if we are willing to turn toward it even, the next healing principle after is expanded perspective. And if we consider turning, then inherently the view widens. What we can see, what we can hear, what we're willing to consider, it really changes everything. And it can make life easier. Some families that I work with don't want to discuss death and dying at all. And the reason I might try to chip away at some of it is because I don't want them to take it all in at once. Sometimes that's just the way it's going to be. But if I can help and support any kind of soft landing in any of that new terrain, I really take that seriously. So again, experiencing interrelatedness, accepting reality as it is, and expanding perspective, not expanded, excuse me. Thinking about those things right now in your own life and wondering where it is that you might have more bravery or courage than you thought to turn towards or lean into something. Maybe it means making funeral home arrangements now, even when you think you don't need them. And the last thing I'll say that feels really important is that life and tenure in life is not a given. And yes, it's important for us all to cultivate this bravery around death and dying specifically, because honestly, it will make our lives more full, more joyful, more precious, even if they're hard. And that as a community of seniors, our precious elders, you set the tone for those who are watching you. And perhaps if you cultivate your bravery, I don't wish this for any of your families, but sometimes the ones younger than us get impacted by death and dying or sickness. And that's what happened in my family. You know, we didn't see my wife's death coming. She was in her 50s. So I invite that bravery for the benefit of all beings. That then when your people need you, you can be that beacon of strength and love to be there for them. So thank you for your listening ears and hearts, and looking forward to more conversation as things progress. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I was okay with going last, kind of, because I knew I was going to have to follow these remarks, but I am glad to be here and loved hearing what you had to say. This is hard. What we're contemplating today, the conversation that we're inviting, it's hard. Remembering those in my life who have died, that kind of gut punch of loss, considering who I still have to lose, contemplating my own death. People often pause when I tell them I lead writing circles exploring grief, death, and dying. Some are curious, but many pause and say things like, have you found people in hospice who might be interested? Or have you posted news of it in senior centers? I'm struck by this, as though exploring these topics are only for those near death or only for those aging. That is not how I view it. And yet, I've noticed something about myself during those pauses, or after I hear those suggestions. I hesitate. As passionately as I feel about this work, I hesitate. Why am I doing this work? Why do I believe it's important for people of all ages and with all life experiences to have these conversations? To consider things like, what is your relationship with death? How exactly have the people who you've known died? What is your worst case scenario of dying? What is your best case? And then in that hesitation, I remember what it's like to be in a room, in a writing circle, where fear and grief are present. I mean, fear and grief are always present, but in this case, they're acknowledged, they're invited in. We've lost people. They died in very specific ways. We are grieving, and we write about that. We write about all the ways death has touched our lives. We write about our fears, from the fear our friends will forget to call or text us on our birthdays, to fear that we'll die alone and financially insecure. And as we feel called to, we share what we write. And something profound happens. I feel less alone. Each person there is less alone. Stephen Levine, a writer best known for his writing on death and dying, says it this way: when shared, my grief becomes the grief. When it is the grief, it has the whole universe to swim in. When it's my grief, I'm standing alone in it. I can feel that happen in the room when grief, when fears about life and death are shared. So I remember that is one reason why I gather people together, why I think community is essential to the work of living, dying consciously. And community can look many different ways. I use writing with others because writing has been my tool of exploration, my tool, the way I try to live consciously. And to do that in community, it's powerful. And I want to argue essential. Hard things require community. I hope after today, you'll open up more to your partner or a family member or a friend or a therapist about grief and death and dying. Good, good, and good. And it's not enough. Remember, feel it in your bones. This is hard. Because if we're really going to die consciously, we're going to have to live consciously. And that's hard. It requires learning to live more in the present, to complete what lies behind us, and to walk clear-eyed into what's ahead. And as odd as it may sound, I don't think our inner circle of family and friends are enough to help us do that. We need others too. We need their stories to help us know our own. Every time I do that worst case, best case scenario of dying, it comes out differently. Because others have helped me think of things I wouldn't have on my own. When I hear their fears, I discover ones that are lurking unconsciously beneath my own and that have been unconsciously affecting my life. What else don't I know? What else do I need to know or do to live more consciously so I can die more consciously? Pema Chodron, in her book, How We Live is How We Die, tells the story of taking her 2 teenage kids to meet one of her Buddhist teachers. Her kids weren't Buddhist, but they were willing to humor their mother on this occasion. Her teacher, when he met them, started giving them Buddhist teachings. During a pause, Pema respectfully told him their kids weren't Buddhist, but was there something meaningful he could say to them despite their lack of that background? Her teacher turned back toward the teenagers, looked them in the eye, and said, "You are going to die." And then he paused and continued, "And you can't take anything with you except your state of mind." Our state of mind. How we work with our mind, emotions, and propensities while living is what will be present when we die, what we'll take with us. One of my best qualities is that I'm tenacious. It's kept me going and pursuing what I want in life. If I want things to be different, organizations, relationships, myself, I change them. This has been my state of mind, that I can make things different. And that quality also works against me. Every book I've read on death and dying, and people have spoken to it here, I kid you not, every book has a very large chapter on acceptance. Acceptance of what is. Acceptance has not been my state of mind. It's not been my practice. Levine writes, "You can't let go of what you don't accept. If I don't accept, I cannot let go." And there's lots I have to let go of. My youth, anger, right now in my life, my 25-year marriage. And in order to do that letting go, I have to accept that I'm aging, that I'm angry, that the love of my life may have a calling away from me at this juncture. And I may too. Acceptance is part of conscious living. It's a practice and it's preparation for conscious dying. When I suggest that people get really specific about the best case scenario of their death, it's not so that they can make that happen. We have limited control over that. It's that sometimes we have to name what we want, to accept what we want, so that when the time comes, if everything isn't exactly the way we want it, we can let it go, our best laid plans, and be with what is. My sister, before a surgery on one of her 3 aortic aneurysms, when I was telling her the work that I was engaged in and trying to invite her into the exploration, she turned to me and said, with a note of irritation, "I am focused on life, not death. If I think about death, I'll die. We were on the porch swing of the cabin our father built in Northwest Pennsylvania. He died a month after his 53rd birthday. I was 19. Our brother cared for the cabin after our dad's death. He died at 57. I wanted to turn to my sister and say, people die, Pam. Your fear, your pushing the reality of it away is constricting your life, not expanding it. I didn't say that, not only because I didn't want to upset her, but because in the face of her commonly held belief that it's good to focus on life and dangerous to focus on death, I questioned myself. I hesitated. Why is it important again to allow death into our awareness? How can it make living richer? Another thing we write and share about in our writing circles is regret and forgiveness, forgiving ourselves, forgiving others. It's been within community that I've gotten clear about my regrets, what I need to forgive myself for, who I have yet to forgive. I thought I knew these things, but in community, hearing others' stories, more is sparked in me. I become clearer about additional work I have to do, and I want to do it now. Frank Ostaseski, co-founder of the Zen Hospice Center, says it this way: to imagine that at the time of our dying, we will have the physical strength, emotional stability, and mental clarity to do the work of a lifetime is a ridiculous gamble. A ridiculous gamble. I love that line. Ostaseski writes that he has sat at the bedside of thousands of people dying. Some came to their deaths full of disappointment. Others blossomed and stepped through that door full of wonder. And what made the difference was, quote, their willingness to live into deeper dimensions of what it means to be human. But aren't I doing that already? The years of therapy, all those self-help books, all the spiritual study? Yes and no. In community, I hear others' stories. The way they wait for X to happen or procrastinate in doing something else. The way they push away what they don't want or fail to embrace what they do. They hesitate to fully engage in a relationship, to learn how to rest, to accept change and not knowing. And I discover those places inside me, the ones I miss because I'm in my own bubble. We're all in our own bubbles. There's only so far any of us can see alone. We need each other. And when we find each other through an honest exploration of grief, of dying and death and what they can teach us, we can start to shift those familiar states of mind. We humans, we resist one of the fundamental truths of existence. There is no end to what we must let go of. Things are always changing. If we cannot find peace with this truth in life, we will have trouble letting go when we die. Levine writes, how we relate to things falling apart right now foreshadows how we'll relate to things falling apart as we die. I don't know about you, but I do not react well to things falling apart. I want it to be different. I hold on. I don't let go. And if that isn't how I want to die, then I have to learn to live differently. Joanna Ebenstein, an author of several books on death and dying, writes there are 4 things that get in the way of people letting go at the end of their lives: regrets, unfinished business, guilt, and shame. Remember, it is a ridiculous gamble to start working through those things when we're near death, if we even have the luxury of not dying suddenly without warning. And we all carry those things, and many of us don't take the time right now to work through them. I was riding bikes with my 23-year-old son recently, telling him about the writing circle I was going to facilitate the next day. I told him we write about regrets and forgiveness, and trying to engage him, I asked, "Do you have any regrets?" "No, not really." "Well," I said, "maybe you're too young for regrets." We rode a few more miles, talked about, unrelated things, when he suddenly said, "I regret not sticking up for this girl in middle school when others were saying things that weren't true about her. It's not like I lose sleep over it. It's not like I'd go find her and apologize now. She probably doesn't even remember. But I regret it." It made me think about the times I hadn't been as kind as I could have been. I hadn't even thought about those kinds of regrets before. But they are regrets, and they are important to identify and share. This is one way we can move closer to being able to die consciously, to not be surprised by regrets that we failed to identify. But it's hard. Have I mentioned that? And hard things require community. If you can't find that community, create it. Read one of the books on the book list in your programs with others. Go to a death cafe. There's a great online community founded by Joanna Epstein called Morbid Anatomy that offers classes on grief and death and dying. People like me offer writing circles, but you can start your own. Be with each other. Death is not an enemy. It is, as my colleagues say, a teacher. It's a gift giver. I don't want to miss the opportunity to receive those gifts. Annie Dillard writes, "How we spend our days is how we spend our lives." I want to spend my life consciously. I don't want to spend my days overwhelmed or having unfinished business with others or staying stuck because I resist what is. I'm a very emotional person, so I used to think, I don't resist life, I get overwhelmed by it. And then I learned, overwhelm is its own kind of resistance. I resist pain sometimes by letting it overwhelm me, and that leads to suffering. You know where I learned that? In community. I'm not just saying that for the sake of these remarks. Only allowing death into my life, something that big, that mysterious, that unknown, and practicing that allowing with others has been powerful enough to motivate me to start shifting those states of mind, to begin spending my days the way I want to spend my life. I don't want to be overwhelmed by death. And that means I have to learn how to not be overwhelmed with life. Ostaseski writes that in his experience, as people come closer to death, only two questions really matter to them. Am I loved? Did I love well? Were I to be fatally injured leaving here today, I believe I could answer both of those questions in the affirmative. Kind of. Because even though I'm loved, I know I've not always been able to fully take it in, been present enough in my own life, not been distracted by worry, anxiety, things like that, I haven't fully taken it in. I know I have regrets, unfinished business, guilt, shame, that have kept me from loving as well as I could have. Gathering in community to explore my life, to allow death to teach me how to live more consciously, I hope I'm given many more years to do this, so that my yeses to those questions are more emphatic, with less equivocation. I do not want to hesitate in my response.
I felt so touched so many times, so deeply, as each of these speakers shared from their hearts. For you as well, yeah. And so many perspectives for us to consider, so much that might make us more brave, more useful, yeah. And so as we move from the breadth and the depth of what's been offered here, I want to encourage some integration, some consolidation, that each of us might think, what was one thing that might be that little pebble that we're taking home in our pocket over our breast or our side pocket, that we might really fondle, that we might hold close to, that might be that nugget that we want to share with somebody else, that we think is maybe one of the most useful things that we heard today. Maybe it was something that surprised us. And I want to ask our panel to just reflect on what they heard from each other. Was there a common theme? Was there something that was a really helpful reminder to you, even though you may do this work every single day? What are you taking away from something that each other said that was maybe the most helpful? And I'll just start as you prepare, and then every person doesn't need to weigh in on these questions, but however you're moved. But this piece of acceptance, and how hard it is, and how seductive the religion of comfortableness is. And one thing I've been trying to say in my own mom's journey in dementia, my brilliant, highly verbal, literate mom, as things are changing, is I'm trying to say, you know what? I'm trying to worship in the church of what's happening now. And certainly what I find that my work helps me do that, and that as I feel in my own family, that cognitive dissonance, and in my country, the cognitive dissonance, this can't be happening. I don't want this to be happening. Well, we are in the church of what's happening now. And so how can we embrace it as holy? So my own capacity to do that was certainly lifted up by each of you speaking. What would you like to reflect on from each other that you're taking?
I have so many thoughts. I mean, this was just like food for my soul, so thank you both. I was really thinking about community, and, you know, as part of my work in hospice, I spent years as a grief counselor, and I've sat through countless support groups, and I ran a children's bereavement camp, and I believe so deeply in the need for community and community as a healing element for people who are grieving in particular. And I was often struck in myself and in others who were grieving a loss, how often there were feelings of shame about it. And if I had $1 for every time someone called me and said, you know, I feel like I'm going crazy, is this normal? and just needed to hear from another human being, like, nope, this is it. This is what happens to us when someone that we love dies. And, I think it's one of the negative outcomes of our inability to share these things with each other is that we don't have the reference points we need. And often that comes from community. And I think the other thing I add to that, two quick things. One is that over again, I saw, I know my mic is cutting out, sorry. Am I doing something that's making that happen, or, okay. So I saw that people who were struggling to know how to be with their grief would be given advice or instruction by others around them, and that it almost never was helpful. And in fact, sometimes was harmful. And that actually what was helpful was community, so a place where they could just let it all hang out, be with it, and then the support to find their own way. And most people find their way, and they don't necessarily need others to tell them what to do. And I've seen that with little children, and I've seen it with people at the ends of their lives. And I think that sense of isolation and shame is so damaging. And if I do anything in my career in hospice, it would be to try to break that down for people. It creates so much unnecessary suffering. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jennifer. Any thoughts, Nancy or Joe, on what you're taking away from what you've heard from each other?
I mean, I appreciate the mention of the humanity of it, that for years I thought, just to put it in this context, I thought spirit as a minister and a chaplain and someone who's basically whole world is spirituality. I kind of thought maybe I had been fed with some perspective that was warped, that it was supposed to look like a certain thing. And I'm so grateful that that's sort of ludicrous. And that's also true about how we do this. Like, I appreciated your conversation with your kid and your reflections, each of you, in kind of the process of, so if we're accepting reality and then we inevitably get that expanded perspective, but what goes into all of these things are a process. They're not they're not an event. They're ongoing opportunities to make relationship with. And we're human beings. And what's really important is that we allow the imperfection which is inherent in who we are. So I'm not positing that as a negative, saying that in order to learn how to do this when the mainstream society, the white dominant sort of colonial culture would tell you that you should feel shame. Certainly going through the last 8 months since Brenda, and I see that there's a Brenda on the front row, and I'm happy to see that there's a Brenda here. It's not lost on me. She's everywhere. But how human it is to be grieving an epic loss. And it is raw as hell, and you sort of think, oh, am I supposed to look like this, or am I supposed to look like that? But once we start getting tripped up, we realize that that's actually severing off essential parts of our human way of living and facing death or going through death. So I think it's necessary to have humor, which I hear from both of you too. Humility is at the core, and to kind of give each other a wide berth around how we navigate these, including ourselves, because we're sort of learning on the job. And that's okay. So that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Joe.
And I'll just add I think that you said it first, Holly, the whole idea of curiosity. I mean, what was so fabulous about, for me, listening to the remarks, like, I think it was you, Jennifer, when you told the story about how people will often, or I think both of you mentioned, people hear what you do and they are like, it can be a conversation stopper. But like the phrase, "Oh, I didn't show up. I didn't want to remember her that way. I don't think that she might want to remember me this way." Like, that is just in the air that we breathe. And so to hear people offering another view of that, and to then, it makes me curious about everything that's been unquestioned. Just to have these conversations, and then I'm like, oh, yeah, it doesn't have to be that way. Are there other ways it can be? Maybe that wasn't the only way of seeing it. So that's what I kept thinking about.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. So our esteemed planning committee proposed a set of topics that our panelists would respond to through their remarks, and I'm checking back here, seeing did we do our job, and I'm checking all of these except for one that sticks out, and that was the invitation to cover the topic of staying open to our immortality. Now, our immortality could be the subject of religious belief, religious or cultural belief. But what I've found in perhaps a multi-faith and a secular context, working as a funeral and memorial celebrant and death doula and community death educator for about a dozen years now, I often say I get to meet the most amazing people in my work, but often after they've died. And so in my work, partnering with bereaved individuals and families and communities to hear the story, to help to put together a eulogy, to co-create a really meaningful funeral or memorial of celebration of life, it can be remarkable, I notice, for the bereaved family members to see how visible that person is. I might deliver a eulogy for someone I've never met, and people will come up, "How long did you know them?" "Well, I just met them. I met them through your stories. We just met Jennifer's mother. We just met Joe's wife, Brenda. I met them through the shape that they're still visible in the world." And I often reflect that one of the oddest euphemisms for avoiding saying death and dying is that we refer to people as lost. And of course, we feel enormous loss. But if I tell you I lost my father, was that like when I lost my keys? And most cultures throughout the world actually know where their ancestors are, where their dead is. But often we're not quite so sure in our dominant cultures. So, well, I've just given you a few of my takes on immortality, but I'd like to invite the panelists to speak to this in whatever order you might like to.
Anybody want to start?
I gave you a little lead time there.
No, I appreciate it. I can dive in, I guess. I have many thoughts and questions about this. Lots of questions, and I'm okay with that. I think that I have come, I'm not probably going to say anything that different than what you just said, but the experience of being present with people who are dying and grieving and experiencing my own losses has just made me so aware that if there's some part of me that will live on in this world, it will be because of the way that I am in relationship to people right here, right now. And that has just become more and more and more important to me. And to try and fail all over and over again to be present and to be in right relationship with people. You know, I have my own spiritual beliefs, and but that to me certainly I don't have children. Like I feel like that will, if there's a legacy, that will be it for me. And I guess because I so treasure the things that my dead people have left with me. I mean, and for me, that is so much. They're still alive. I think about my dad, I think every day. And he's someone who I really hope that I can emulate how he was in his life. And I, you know, one of the things that does make me sad is that many times people who are grieving are given subtle and overt messages that somehow they just have to like put this person who's died and their memories and their grief aside, like you could put it in a shoebox up in a closet and kind of move on, and that is the picture of healing. And it is completely not what happens. I mean, any of us who've lost someone know that we figure out one way or another how to carry them forward with us, and that the relationship goes on. And so I guess I'll stop there, but that's what I would think about.
I have a couple of probably million thoughts, but I think the reason I paused at first is because some of this is more somatic than kind of cerebral, but time isn't promised. You know, it's a privilege, which is an odd word too, because sometimes life doesn't feel like that. But none of us know what's around the corner, and that can be really lovely things too, you know. But we just don't know. So in light of that, how do we live? You know, and I'm with you, like the legacy, I don't have kids, I went the four-legged dog route, which my mom thought was actually genius. Really, she said, I think that's a great idea. I'm like, okay. But I have nieces and nephews who are watching me. And of course, we're all my relations, you know. And so I just want to love, and I want that to be the legacy. Now, love is a big word, and it's very intricate and dynamic and flexible, and I commit continuously to understanding more and more about love. And I think spirituality and religion, there's a lot there. And I think ultimately, if we can take the headiness out of it, all of them are a guide to how to live in a good way, to take care of people, that our cultivated response then, if we think of our state at end of life, cultivated through a life of lived experience and imperfections, getting it right, getting it close to right, really getting it totally wrong, is like cultivating that beauty within us that's already there, but I guess then perhaps more of a word is remembering it. In the Zen tradition, the founder of Soto Zen, Dogen, said, take the backward step and turn the light inward. It's all there, including this is impermanent. And so some people might say, well, then it's not important. Au contraire. What we do in this only happens in this. And I believe in a consciousness that continues. And, you know, the ancestors are amongst us, always. We just have to remember. And, but our lifespan is not a given. So let's live in a way that hopefully that doesn't put a gratuitous pressure of, oh my God, I gotta, it's like, no, just be yourselves, but But in not taking it for granted, we will inevitably be kinder. We will inevitably see a hungry person, and the only impulse is to see what they might want to eat. And I'll share the last thing I'll say, and this is very personal, so I often am very discerning about when I say it, but I think it's really important, is that the last words that my absolutely gorgeous, thoughtful, intelligent, creative, full of life, robust wife said before she closed her eyes and went into her inner journey for a week before she left her body. She said, with her eyes closed already and a sweet smile on her face, with two of us sitting at her bedside, if I'd have known it was going to be like this, I would have done it sooner. Come on. I mean, come on. You can't contrive these things, because when people are dying, there is no more ego left to micromanage. The purity of heart just becomes, and that's all I need to know. That also tells me that it's not over, and also tells us that what we do here is so important. So, yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Brenda.
I don't know if I have a lot to add to that. I mean, immortality, I know that I agree that people talk about legacy and legacy projects, and not that those aren't important, but our legacy is right now. Like our legacy is how we're living our lives and how we are in relationship to people. And I know that, I remember when my brother died, at the memorial, I spoke, but other people were saying different things. And the things that some of his friends were saying, that is not the brother that I knew at all. But what that brought to mind for me was that, like, it takes a village to know somebody. Like, everybody holds a piece of us. So all of those relationships, in whatever form they are, is the part of immortality, is how we live on, not just in our primary relationship, but in all the relationships that we have. We continue in them, in all those people. So.
Beautiful. Please, another round for our esteemed panel. And with Nancy leaving us with "It Takes a Village," what a great reminder to stop by the Viva Village table if you're not already a member. And Carol, you're going to give a little preview of what's to come.
Yeah, so thank you to our guests here. I know that I'm not speaking because there are a lot of things that I'm thinking about right now. So thank you very, very much. It is 2:30. We are going to resume at 2:55. So they have 25 minutes to get up. The restrooms, if you need the restrooms, you go through the hall where the refreshments are and through the wooden doors in the back, and they're right there. Please help yourselves to refreshments. And if you have cards with questions on them, there will be folk back here to collect those. And if you have evaluations, which I'm hoping you will do, there a couple people with baskets. There's going to be one on the table here and another one in the where the refreshments are. So I hope you stick around. We have still more to come with your questions. And again, thank you all for being here, and thank you, and we'll see you in 25 minutes. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, folks. I think next year our snacks are going to be lukewarm water and celery sticks. Just saying. We thought this was going to be plenty of time for, people to, but it doesn't. Nancy and her crew have done a fantastic job of putting out some really lovely snacks. And again, thank you to them for doing that. So we're getting our guests mic'd up again. I will tell you that that we had some absolutely fantastic questions, and it was hard going through them. We've tried to lump some topics together because we had several that were kind of in the same theme, and so I know I'm not going to get to. I know we're not going to get to all the questions that were asked, and I apologize for that. What I will ask. And I'm not going to ask for a commitment right now, but if we have questions that we received that are unanswered, I'm going to send them to our guests, and if they would be willing to write back just a brief response sometime in the next few weeks, then we will post those as well, if that's okay with you folks. I'm putting them on the spot, so I'm not going to ask for a commitment right now, but we really had to do some really terrific questions. Some of them I can give you some quick answers right now. One of them was, how can I reach the speakers after the program? And again, I apologize for not getting this into the program, but if you contact the Viva Village office, they will be glad to provide you with the contact information for all of our speakers today. We had several questions about burial and options, green burials, some other kinds of things. We had questions about death with dignity, and I know there's another term for that right now, and I apologize, I don't remember what it is. And also we're asking for more information about hospice and those sorts of things. Those, I think we're going to be talking to Kathy Fradkin and Janet Cruz about having some of those topics as forum possibilities where we can actually address those issues more completely than we can here in the time that's remaining. So keep an eye on the calendar, because I think that with all the questions we had generated today about those topics, I think we're going to be hopefully seeing those in the forum. And a couple just real quick ones. Nancy, you recommended a book about community. Which book was that specifically? Can you? No. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one then. I'll get right back to you. Joe, your book that you have on your. The book that you have there on your lap by Paula, can you give that reference again? Because I don't think it's in our reference list.
Yep, it's Dr. Paula Arai, A-R-A-I, and the book is Bringing Zen Home would be the main part. There's more letters to that, but Bringing Zen Home should find you, and Paula Arai is the scholar. A-R-A-I. A-R-A-I. Great. Yes.
Bringing Zen Home. Great, thank you. And then...
Do you want me to say
I'm sorry,
Zen?
what?
Zen, Z-E-N.
Z-E-N, Bringing Zen. Or maybe there's probably a great book out called Bringing Them Home, too. But it's Bringing Zen Home. And Nancy, you had a recommendation for...
Because it's not on the bibliography, this book, but in terms of community, it's not necessarily about community, but there are so many wonderful exercises and activities that would be a wonderful book to have to form community around. And it is by Joanna Ebenstein, E, B as in boy, E-N-S-T-E-I-N, and the title is Memento Mori. Memento Mori, M-E-M-E-N-T-O, Mori, M-O-R-I. Joanna Ebenstein.
Terrific, thank you. And Nancy, this one specifically for you, would you go through the 4 things that you were talking about with regret, shame, guilt.
Yeah, it was, and this
Yes.
was from Joanna Ebenstein, too, who named these 4 categories: regrets, unfinished business, guilt, and shame.
Great, thank you.
I mean, people regret a whole bunch of things, but I thought it was interesting that she put it in these 4 categories.
Thank you. Okay, so again, we had a really nice stack of questions, and it was hard to consolidate some of these. But one of the big ones was, how can I start a conversation with my family about my inevitable death, including having that conversation with young children? And this was, one of the people was a grandparent who wanted to talk to young children about the possibility of their death, or the inevitability of their death. So the 4 of you would like to hear what you have to say about that.
There are some wonderful children's books about death and dying. I really, I don't have a list of them for you off the top of my head, but would be happy to send some so that is a wonderful way to open up conversation with children. I would say that as a general rule and as a culture, we tend to really underestimate the extent to which children are aware of death and thinking about death and capable of engaging with the topic. So many years of being around grieving children taught me that they're 100% thinking about it. They're having experiences that tell them about it, and if you aren't talking to them about it, you're leaving it up to chance and possibly influences that you would not want them to be influenced by. And you know, as human beings, it's just our nature to fill in information gaps with our own understanding of things. And so this is the unfortunate thing that happens with children when they're left out of the family experience of death and dying and the conversation about it. And so Joe was saying on the break, and I 100% agree, that the most powerful way to engage with these topics often is storytelling. So whether it's reading a book with them or sharing stories with them about your own experiences. Is there something you want to tell them about when your parents or your grandparents died, and what helped you during that time? Anyway, this is a huge topic and very close to my heart. And I would just say, as a general rule, it's important to remember that even the concept of death itself, which as an adult I find mind-boggling, is children of different ages may not understand it in the way that we do. Like the idea, for example, that death is not reversible is completely not part of how very young children think about it. So I would say maybe educate yourself a little bit about how children understand death, and then start opening up the conversation. And I think we worry that it's going to harm children, and if we talk about death, but I think the opposite is true. I have encountered so many adults in my life who deeply regret that no one talked to them in their own childhood about the losses that they were experiencing. So you can do that for your grandchildren.
Holly, you have some ideas.
One of the great classics of the books written for children has just reached its 25th anniversary, and it's by a local author. It's called Tear Soup by Pat Schweibert, and it's been put in waiting rooms, in hospitals, and children's grief programs all around the world, Tear Soup. But I work mostly with folks who are trying to prepare for their deaths, whose adult children have rebuffed them. I wish I could talk to my children, but they say, "Mom, don't be morbid. You're not going to die. We don't want to talk about it." And so I would just encourage not only telling this story that might include, I wish my parents had talked to me about it, or I'm making a list of my regrets that I don't want to have. Please don't make this one of my regrets that we haven't had this conversation. And please do it for me. You may not need it, but I need it, might be one approach. And the Conversation Project, started by Ellen Goodman, the journalist, has wonderful resources for games and very practical ways to break through the inhibition of family dynamics. And they encourage an annual conversation at Thanksgiving. And I do know some families that have managed to make this an annually, we are going to talk about this and update each other on where we're at. So if you have a success story, tell each other about it, because this is such a common way of being lonely in families. They won't let me have this conversation.
Thank you. Joe and Nancy, do you have other ideas about how to open this conversation with perhaps a reluctant spouse or close friends? Or we also talk about advocates, because I know a lot of people are living by themselves. They don't have children. They don't have spouses, but they have other people who are very important in their lives. And do you have anything else to add to some of those suggestions?
I mean, I think these are simply conversations that have to happen. And sometimes we have to break free of our own internalized, inhibition. I love that you use that word. And say, I know this is uncomfortable, but also, like you said, Holly, I need to talk about it. And because I love you and I care about you, and I don't want you to be left with a mess if something happens. And it shouldn't always take a terminal diagnosis like it did for us to say, please tell me your passwords. Please get me on your bank account. There's just ways that life is easier when we address things up front, and often without the pressure of time and the privilege, or at least the appearance of the privilege of time. So perhaps the biggest work is, disentangling the internalized inhibitions of a mainstream culture that just does not want us to talk about something that happens every day, and human up in a loving way and do what you need to do. And I acknowledge it is not comfortable always. And yet the only way things change is by taking up space to change them. So find your allies and take ownership of your process and do it through love. I think that's always a good way. I don't know if that helps, but...
I guess I would just add that I think the more that we ourselves can become comfortable, the easier it will be to have the conversations with others. So sometimes it's easy to say, well, they don't want to have the conversation, or it's going to be hard for them to partake in the conversation. But sometimes it's about, well, we haven't quite gotten comfortable enough with wanting to do it. And that if we can do that, I think also the conversations become easier. Does that make sense? I said that.
It sounds like love and courage are the two operative words here, right? Thank you. We had several questions about the idea of being in our senior years, most of us in here, as a developmental stage, and questions about the transition. Is death a transition between our current life and afterlife? And you've all been sitting at people's deathbeds. How are those questions, how do they come up? What are some of the answers that people have come with, or what are some of your ideas about that idea of death as a transition, and our senior years as a transition to whatever one's belief is, but what may or may not happen next?
I mean,
this crowd does not come up with easy questions. I love it.
I'm just trying to step back, but obviously as a hospice chaplain, these are kind of conversations that are common. Certainly as people present to me religious or spiritual concepts that they have lived by. We're sitting in a religious or spiritual home right now that would present a very particular way. Perhaps some of you are congregants here. There are ways of understanding life in the broadest sense, and then the meaning of life that relates to the bigger picture, not just what we're here to accomplish here in this skin, in this body, but perhaps a religious or spiritual connotation to that, or a goal, or and I certainly meet people of all faiths, non-faiths, indigenous peoples, just about every kind of person with a sense of what the bigger picture might mean. I'm always interested as well in when the rubber hits the road, what do things mean? So cultivating a spirituality, and I use that word to include perhaps the broader relationship with one's life. It's okay. Doesn't have to have a name. That actually supports us when we need it the most. And so I will definitely start out by saying this is a deeply personal conversation, and I certainly wouldn't dream of telling anybody, even if they back me into a corner as a chaplain, to say, tell us how it is, or tell us what's right, or what's true, and no. But through my observations of watching hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people die, I felt common themes energetically that come through outside of a structure of a belief system, which gives me a sense of peace, that there is a human experience of being in a body, and there is a human experience of leaving the body. And I have had so many people look over my shoulder and look at or speak of people that I am not privy to see, because it's not my business to see, in the room. I mean, it happens so frequently that it is just a part of the reality that ancestors come and beings come and love comes to escort us out from the most familiar to the unfamiliar, to the new. I have my own belief systems, but they're less belief, they're more lived experiences of seeing that there is more than what is happening here, and also that what's happening here is really precious and special, but that the two are connected. And I engage ritual in my life to remind me of that. So what does that mean in terms of this threshold? I have a home altar to Brenda, specifically right now, or when I lose somebody, that stays in my home and always has a candle. Doesn't have any religious affiliation. It's that they are still with me. I fundamentally feel it. And when I go to the store, I buy flowers as if I was buying them for her in the living room. I light a candle, I put her favorite foods. And these are traditions that happen across the globe, like in millions and millions and millions of our brothers and sisters on the planet in different countries just simply live this way, including our indigenous brothers and sisters right here who engage ritual, and who absolutely, if you are spending time in an indigenous context, the spirit realm is a given. Any prospect that it might not be is just, it's a way of life. But I think it has to be personally explored and experienced and has to feel authentic to you. And some of you in here will have had experiences with the spirit realm. I'm someone who has them all the time, but not everybody does, but I don't then prescribe that that's the way it needs to be for others, So that's kind of a long answer, but it's a big question. But live life knowing that our life here has value and ripples out in ways we cannot comprehend. And that's powerful and beautiful and inspiring. However that looks for you, live that,
Yeah,
One thing
please.
too that I think what came up for me with the question was the transition was kind of the question, and often in hospice we use the language of transitioning to talk about when someone is starting to change in certain ways that give us an idea that death may be closer. And I love that word transition because it's rarely just an event, right? It truly is a process. And very much like birth, dying has some really common things that happen, and yet every death is different. On the break, I was talking with Marie, who's in the back of the room, who was one of the most amazing hospice nurses I worked with, and I'm sure she has seen this so many times that it's not just a physical process. So of course our physiology is part of it, but there's some very common things that happen as people begin to kind of detach a bit from things that might have been really important to them previously, and they just don't care about them anymore, or they don't have the energy to care about them. And there seems to be kind of an inward turning often, or focusing on the love, as Joe was saying, the people around them that are important to them, and some fairly predictable kind of physiological changes and spiritual things. So I'm just saying that to say it is a process, and if people have the opportunity to have kind of a gradual dying process, there are a lot of things that you will see happen over and over again if you have the privilege to be with people. And yet, many people have no idea that that's the case, and that process can be very frightening to witness with someone that you love if you don't understand what's happening. And so I think part of what hospice tries to do is prepare people for that, right? Help arm them with information about what might be coming and how they can intervene to help their loved one. But my sense of that is that kind of like Joe was saying, it is about the body, but it's definitely not just about the body. There's so much that's going on that, frankly, I don't even understand what's happening there, but I come away often from someone's bedside feeling like there's a depth of something that's happening there that is mysterious to me, and that mystery is part, I think, of what attracts me to this work also.
And there are the deaths that are sudden, deaths due to violence, accident, overdose, heart attack, and so forth. And that can leave us very bereft, perhaps, if we're not able to think about what we might imagine the tasks of transition to be. And so I also sometimes think about, rather than the sort of exceptionalism of an individual life in a linear fashion, or even of a human life, about the great wheel of life. You know, we have these beautiful fall decorations here, these pumpkins that I imagine will go onto a compost pile, and they will have a future life, and good for you for wanting to talk about green burial too. But one of the quotes in your packet that to me offers one of the other big picture frameworks here for the afterlife is Dr. Sherwin Nuland, who's in his book, How We Die, wrote, "We've been given the miracle of life because trillions upon trillions of living things have prepared the way for us and have died, in a sense, for us. You know, everything we ate today, what fuels the electricity here." And he says, "We die in turn so that others may live. The tragedy of a single individual becomes, in the balance of natural things, the triumph of ongoing life."
So we had some questions about deathbed visions, which I think all four of you can address. We talked, several of you mentioned the idea of preciousness and sacredness and, let's see, and state of mind. And I was wondering if you could talk about how are those expressed in people's final moments or final days?
I mean, I think something that I love is when people start losing their quote unquote faculties. Hallelujah. Because what is so beautiful is the purity of heart that comes forth when people's linear mind starts to fade. Honestly, it often happens because of pure system fatigue. But it's also on a metaphysical level, a part of how we go back to our true hearts before we leave, you know? And so in terms of state of mind, often I think dominant culture might think of that as precision, maintaining control, that things have to be like a, you know, and it really is not that. It's like when I come to someone's house and I've been working with them, or I'm just meeting them for the first time, and I see that they're starting to go into that non-linear place, makes me fall in love with them, because it's the most, there's an innocence, and innocence is not a pejorative. It's like, that's sacred. What's our most true way of being without all of the added things that we have to learn in a way to live in this world, to stay guarded, to stay, you know, on track with all the tasks. And there's such a sweetness. And I feel like that's a precious place to get to, and yet often people then say, Mum's not able to, you know, we see it as like a negative, like the wheel's coming off, but actually the wheel must come off in order for people to do the final work, which is shedding those things, that then they can just be with their pure selves. And to be around that energy, to me, is like one of the highest vibration, one of the biggest gifts. I find myself, I get a bit giddy, because I literally, my heart just then, their heart, it's like the energy of that it's contagious. And maybe they pick these things up. I love it. You know, these phones, right? You know, there are whole worlds, but then people don't have any clue. And I'm like, oh, how beautiful, and yet how vulnerable, you know? So, yeah, precious. That really is precious.
I was just on the deathbed visions. I do really recommend that article from the New York Times. And I started my hospice career at Hopewell House, and so was at many, many, many deathbeds, and saw so many versions of the deathbed visions, and you know, often had this sense that as people were getting close to death, it really did feel like they were sometimes visiting another place or time or experience and then coming back, and sometimes you were lucky enough that they could tell you something about what was going on. And definitely people would describe being visited by loved ones or angels or other things that we don't have words for. And it just happens, and I can't explain it to you. And when I was taking care of my dad when he was dying, he was just such a sweet human being, and he had grown up in a family with 8 siblings, and 4 of his brothers had died, preceded him in death, and so I was taking care of him one night, and he woke me up, and I was feeling tired and cranky, and he kind of sat up, and he had this like sort of impish look on his face, and it reminded me of the pictures I had seen of him when he was a little boy. And he had this kind of little crooked grin that was so cute. And he said to me, me and those 4 guys over there have to go pee. And I remember thinking, oh, the brothers are here. So anyway, it can be the sacred to the profane, but it does happen, and it seems to be fairly universally comforting to people. So.
You know, I love hearing these stories, and there also is a part of me that gets very sad. That is not what the people who I've loved experienced. A couple of them were in the hospital. The other one was so afraid of death that she just wanted to be kind of knocked out. It wasn't even necessarily the pain, but she didn't. So I guess one thing that's coming up for me is, it is, I guess, what I said in my remarks too, and what others have referenced. We have to become really uncomfortable with not knowing, with all that we do not know, like not just about dying, but our life, the uncomfortableness of not knowing, so that we can be open to those visions and those stories, that we can allow ourselves the space for that to happen and not want to hide from it or become medicated out of it, or all those things I think that do get in the way of us being able to have those better stories, those better experiences. So.
Because I definitely don't want to give the impression too that there's any one way that this happens. And certainly I've seen people really appear to struggle as they leave, and to fight and to be frightened. All those things happen. And the last thing I'll say is I really have come away from my experience with the belief that there is some healing inherent in the process. And I can't tell you for a fact that I know that that's happened, but it is my experienced sense of what is happening for people.
Yeah, death can be a hard labor. Coming into this world can be pretty hard. And I had someone challenge me once and say, if you have an event about death and you don't talk about what can be hard, it's like having an event about birth and saying, if you recently gave birth, please don't come. And if you do, please don't talk about how painful it was, because then nobody will want to do it. But I think this piece about the great mystery and letting loose of control, for some that can be well practiced and welcomed, and for others it goes against every cultural imperative that we have for control and for competency. And I was with an older friend who was dying, who had practiced for his death for so many years as a very serious meditator, and really had expected to have a conscious dying process. But he was heavily medicated, and it was very confusing. And pain management is a beautiful, beautiful gift. And we do have the most heavily medicated dying population in the world here in this country. And a lot of it is with the anxiety, and that it's very difficult for the people around the dying person to see what's just normal, a normal process of dying. Again, that hard labor that we may go through. So my friend had been in and out of consciousness, one of those where the hospice folks will say, well, I don't think I'll see him again. But then he would rally. And during one of those rallies, he asked if I would dial a friend of his that he wanted to speak to. And I had to hold the phone to his head. He was that weak. And I heard him saying, well, I don't know what my dying will look like. Maybe Holly knows. I was hoping I might learn something here. So after I kind of recovered myself and he'd finished his call, I said to him, Bill, I did hear you wondering what your dying will look like. Is that something you see happening in the future? And he said, oh, is that what's happening now?
Kind of in line with this, what about the idea that we are human and therefore have imperfections and regrets? And as we think about our death, how can we address those issues of our imperfections and of the regrets that we do have in our lives, that will make our living now a little bit easier, and certainly hopefully make our death a little easier.
Get support. Do it in community.
Yeah.
Get a great therapist. No shame in that. Everybody should have one. You know, because we need that mirroring and also that skill set to help bring out the things and hold container for the things that we need, that are our deepest places we need to go. And if you have a spirituality that you relate to, engage it more ruggedly, perhaps, and be honest or be vulnerable and open so that you can even maybe speak out loud those things that you thought you never would, you know? Yeah. And maybe imperfection is even a wrong word because it still sets up a binary of good and bad, which it's a word we use, and I get it. At some point we have to say something, but, you know, certainly there are things that we do in our lives sometimes are really hard to reconcile. So how do we engage the life that we have, the people that we love, and do what you spoke of around getting together, create a writing group, you know, doing these things, but taking care of ourselves so that we can start turning towards those things that we didn't necessarily feel brave enough to or felt too vulnerable to. Often when we say things out loud, they perhaps dissipate to some degree. Then, you know, they have less control over us.
Yeah, I think the work that you're talking about that's in that question, I think I already said this, but it's hard. It is hard, and I just don't think we can do it alone. We just really do need community, because while it's hard, I think, right, I kind of drummed with the hardness thing, but it is also what opens the door to gratitude, to a sense of belonging. Belonging, knowing we belong, feeling we belong, that is what is available to us even more when we share the hard things. That's what gets opened up in us. There's a quote by Francis Weller. I'm going to botch the quote, but it's like, if we can hold grief in one hand and gratitude in the other and be stretched large by these two forces in our lives, and if we're just over here in grief, it can become brittle, and I'll just stay with brittle. And then if we just stay in gratitude, then we can't have compassion for others suffering. We need both. And so instead of really thinking in terms of imperfections or whatever, if we can think about it as just like, this is life. We have these things that are hard, and if we can join in community around them and let them out, then we are more open to all the gifts, all the belonging, all the generosity that is also in our lives. But we kind of need to see it as a whole. And I think we can only see it as a whole if we're with other people. You know, it's that whole village thing.
I do want to ask Holly, I'm going to put her on the spot here. So the first time I met Holly was at a series of films that she was facilitating. And in one of the films was a person who was in the very active stage of dying and had a conversation with his daughter about the regrets in his life. And I remember at one time somebody came in and kind of minimized those regrets. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because I think if you can talk about that incident just a little bit and what you took away from it.
Sure. Thanks, Carol. The film is called The Last Flight Home, and it is available if you have streaming services. You might need to pay for it. The Last Flight Home, it's a documentary of a dying man who did choose to use medical aid in dying, MAID, what the sort of more technical term for death with dignity is. And one of his daughters was a documentary filmmaker, and the other a rabbi. And someone viewing the film afterwards said, look how well he showed off both his daughters, because he insisted that his daughter, the rabbi, be his rabbi. She said, Dad, I need to just be your daughter. The daughter, who is a documentary filmmaker, was just trying to capture her dad on film while she still could for the family use. And it was only looking at the footage afterwards that she said, we need to share this with the world. He would want to share this with the world. And I think your quotes may also include one from Parker Palmer, who says, the soul does not want to be advised or fixed. He may have said something like, the soul simply wants to be witnessed just as it is. And so it was actually specifically a Jewish practice of a form of atonement, of facing one's regrets in life, that the rabbi daughter was sitting down to do with her dad, and other family members tried to sort of get him off the hook. Dad, you've lived a great life. Dad, you've been such an amazing dad. And to kind of talk him out of any things that he might have been carrying in terms of shame, in terms of guilt, in terms of having fallen below the mark of what he thought a good life would have been. And it was his rabbi daughter who said, no, this has to be his narrative. It's not about us trying to talk him into a different story of his life. It's about him coming to terms with his own life. And I do think one of the hardest things that we have is resisting that urge to try to fix or advise others, and to just be with the full catastrophe, as it's called, right, of being human. And maybe I can offer to this something from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a culture that integrates life and death. Because so often I think we say, yeah, I do want to be more present for people's grief or around death, but I don't know what to say. I don't want to say the wrong thing. And the Tibetan Book of the Dead advises a dying person, and I would also say probably a grieving person, most needs to be shown as much unconditional love as possible, as we've been hearing in a core theme. Don't think you have to be an expert. Be natural, be yourself, be a true friend, and the dying person will be reassured that you are really with them, one human being to another.
Just if you have a real brief question, sure.
When she took, the three boys, almost 4, 7, and 9, were with Barbara when she took her last breaths. And when you think of all the confusing things adults say to children about death, being present was so valuable for them. They saw the spirit leave her body and got that. And later when we were having the memorial service, a helping mother said to Nathan, the youngest one, and Nathan, this afternoon is your mother's celebration of life. And Nathan looked at her and said, well, she won't be there. She's dead.
Thank you. Thank you. We just have a few more minutes. I was wondering if you'd like to have a few closing remarks. We can start with Nancy, and if you don't, that's okay. I think we have had some amazing conversations, and I'm hoping people are going away with maybe a few thoughts that they hadn't had before. But Nancy, would you like to start and just Anything in closing?
Yeah, I don't really have much except that it's so exciting for me to be with these people, to be with all of you, to be having these conversations. I remember thinking about my ancestors, my parents, my siblings. They made it so much harder. They made it harder on themselves. They made it harder on us by not having these conversations. They just made it so much harder. And so I'm just glad to be here. I think to make it easier on all of us. Easier might not be the right word. Just not so hard and just richer. Just being able to see death as another stage of our development that we are preparing for and being with. Yeah.
Thank you. That's all I have to say.
I'm sure some of you have encountered this. I'll just share it quickly. It's a nice thing to put in your pocket and carry away. Ira Byock has written some books about dying well, and he had a nice way of sort of encapsulating some wisdom about the process with the things that we might say to each other as we're dying. And so the first one is, thank you. The next one is, I love you. Please forgive me. I forgive you, and goodbye. And so those are things we don't have to wait to say to each other. And it's a nice little package, so.
It can be very overwhelming to think about preparing for one's death, getting right by death. Look at all the books to read and the conversations to have and the paperwork to fill out. So bringing it down to those few simple words. We also have the example of an unnamed nun from the 6th century who said, "Here at the end, part of me wants to go back and kiss every inch of road that I walked. But it's enough to say thank you and goodbye."
I don't know how we can end this any better. In this time of Thanksgiving, I certainly do thank all 4 of you and for your sharing your experience and for the work that you're continuing to do in our community. And thank you so much for being here. And also, I really personally. Thank you. I personally want to thank each one of you. I do thank each one of you for being here in support of this program and Viva Village and what we've worked on for the last 9 months. It means a lot that we've had such great attendance and questions. And if you have evaluations, there's some folks back there. And again, thank you so much. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you. And come back here next year, we'll have another great thing. So thank you all.